Alissa Timoshkina is a food writer and historian who specialises in Eastern European food culture. Her work has included supper clubs, culinary classes, a cinema and dining experience, and in 2022, after Russia invaded Ukraine, Alissa co-founded the Cook for Ukraine campaign with hierarchies. Her cookbook, Salt and Thyme, is one of our readers' favourites and is also for sale downstairs. And we are very much looking forward to the release of her new cookbook early next year. So thank you for coming again, everyone, and we hope you enjoy the event.
Thank you so much for inviting us to speak tonight. I'll be moderating the talk. Catriona will be doing most of the talking. Also, just to warn you that I've had a baby recently, and this is my first sort of public outing since then. So if I start forgetting names and things, please don't judge me too harshly.
I don't have that excuse.
It's a real honor, just from myself, to say that 10 years ago I did a PhD in Soviet film history, so Catriona is a big name for me, and this is the first time that we get to sit together on stage, and it's a real honor for me to interview her. This book, I think, is a really important contribution to anyone who's interested in Russian, Soviet, post-Soviet culture, but food specifically. And I think especially right now, it's a really important thing to keep talking about. Talking and questioning and relearning and questioning some more what Russia really means. And I'm going to start with a big question. What is Russian food? And when we use the term, what do we actually mean? And if you could comment on how this term is perceived outside Russia and inside Russia, as well as by former Soviet countries.
Okay, thank you very much. And can I say also my thanks to the organisers of the talk, and I'm really glad to be speaking with Alissa, because Salt and Thyme is one of the best Russian cookbooks that I know, and it just is a revolutionary book in many ways, precisely because it doesn't simply present the standards. And also I warm to a book which doesn't think that salade d'olivier is the highest perfection. That's one of my stumbling blocks. But anyway, I think this is a really fascinating question, and I have sort of two simple answers. And one simple answer is a narrow one, that Russian food is defined by a certain set of historical traditions, and it's actually quite narrow, and it would be black bread, sour cream, for instance, sour milk products, fish, not that much meat historically, and historically Russians haven't eaten, for example, that much pork. And on the other hand, the immediate problem with that is that a similar diet is eaten over lots of parts of Northern Europe, and it's quite difficult to define how globally Russian food is different. It's much easier to say how it's different from, say, Ukrainian food, which uses more vegetables, is sort of got more pronounced southern coloration, although that would be southern Ukraine rather than northern and eastern Ukraine. And then another question would be, couldn't you just say that Russian food is what Russians eat? And that's not at all necessarily the same. And one remark that's come back to haunt me in the book is when I said that sushi, as eaten in Russia, didn't really have much to do with Japan. It was very much a Russian food. And then actually the last time I was in Russia, I was served some baked sushi, which I have to say it's not widely eaten in Tokyo as far as I know. So, and so that was very much an example of how foods will become naturalised. And the book includes more actually foods that have become naturalised, which were originally, as far as we know, certainly at the sort of period since 1800, were more characteristic of other parts of what was then the Russian Empire. One stage of the Soviet Union is now the former Soviet Union, and so rice was rather a sort of a luxury food actually in 19th century Russia, and it's not until you get to the Soviet period when more or less any canteen could offer you some sort of watery rice with this, and then pies with watery rice and sort of rather greasy sort of pilaf equivalent, which is Central Asian, didn't taste all that like, much like Central Asian pilaf, which you got in a provincial Russian canteen. And I should emphasize that my longest exposure to Soviet food was in the Russian provinces, and I think that's a very specific experience. I mean, it wasn't eating at Moscow's best restaurants at all. I mean, I've eaten at Moscow's best restaurants about twice in my entire life. So those are the sort of 2 or 3 things. I mean, there's the fact that even if you get Russian food traditions, then another, I suppose, thing I should throw in is the fact that Russian traditional food has changed. So if you look at sort of the 16th century household manual of Dana Stroy, you'll see that they had something that was like haggis. 19th century cookbooks sometimes also give evidence that people at least knew about this dish, and in modern Russia I think it really wouldn't be seen as kind of Russian food at all. So it's highly, if you like, mutable. I mean, the sort of borders are quite permeable, and at the same time a lot of people are quite insistent on what is Russian food and isn't Russian food, and that's historically been the case. So there's a really sort of strong patriotic tradition of sort of modern equivalent of that would be to say no to colonisation. Yes, an awful pun. Colonisation. Colonisation. Kvass is the health of the nation. So kvass and cola, that sort of discrepancy, although sort of sickly drinks have been quite widely drunk historically. So that's a kind of, if you like, a sort of compartmentalised answer, but it's complicated. So a sort of typical academic answer that, I'm not telling you something that you could summarise in 3 words.
That's great, thank you. And we're definitely going to delve into.
Excuse me, could you please hold your microphone closer to the mouth?
Yeah,
so
sure.
you can hear the sound.
Yeah.
It's really interesting that you ended your answer on the cola and kvass sort of pun, and it's really fascinating. It's a phenomenon that I've been really interested in, the way that Russia is constantly defining itself as nasha Tvet, and that they name the product from the West, and they sort of either dig something up from the past and rebrand it in a way that cola and the Nikola class is obviously one of the most obvious examples. Could we talk more about Russia and its relationship to the West? You talk in the book about, we all know about, of course, the Iron Curtain and the standoff between the Soviet Union and the United States and kind of the West at large. And of course, Putin's obsession with the West is very known and is a big problem, I'd say. But you talk about going much further before the Soviet era, when there was a lot of fascination yet resistance to the West and the merchants who did travel, and of course the borders are very porous. Yet there was always this sense that we have to defend our food against these influences.
Exactly. So Catriona Kelly's book, which was first published in 1842, she says in that, I want to talk about the food that's kind of our food, the sort of food that's good for our stomachs, something that's sort of a health thing, it's digestible. And then she includes lemons and olives, so it's a kind of, I think it's that double thing. And I mean, it's not hypocrisy, I'm not trying to make fun of it, well, I'm only trying slightly to make fun of it. And I mean, you get exactly the same sort of phenomenon in the English kitchen, actually, that there's English healthy food and there are foreign French messes, and I think it's, obviously, you wouldn't see much sign of that in London now, but certainly when I was a child that was still around, and I remember having this really weird conversation with somebody in Oxford who sort of was mildly taking exception to the part of Oxford we lived in, because she said, when we lived there, we could hardly get a green vegetable, and so I said, well, it's not like that now, kind of aubergines, I mean, all kinds of turnip tops, various sort of types of South Asian vegetables that I can't even name. She said, oh yes, but I don't suppose we get our English vegetables. So I'm sort of thinking, what would that be? Would that be sea kale? So I think that, that seems to be sort of, it's articulated as a Northern European thing, I think, because Northern Europe has sort of had more food imports, and on the other hand, sort of adherence to food tradition has been kind of really quite inflexible in some ways, especially in France and Italy, and it's sort of France and Italy started
literally any cuisine, any national cuisine or regional cuisine. And I'm currently reading a book from a Ukrainian chef, who he's sort of a, I guess you could say like a Jamie Oliver in Ukraine maybe. He won MasterChef, and especially since the beginning of the war, he's been a real sort of fierce face for authentic Ukrainian cuisine. And I can understand that because, you know, when your culture and your whole country's physically, you know, being annihilated, you really need to stand up and, you know, say this is authentic Ukrainian. Why is Russia so obsessed with this sort of notion of authenticity and constantly sort of trying to talk about authentic stuff, and this idea of samobытность and authenticity is very pertinent in culture, but specifically in food as well?
Yes, I mean, there's an interesting question why it should specifically be food. I mean, the first answer is to do with the fact that this country has historically felt under threat in a very bizarre way. I mean, this continues at the moment. We have, you know, the sort of sole nuclear power in Eurasia, somewhere with by far the biggest army and, you know, richest and best resourced economy, and at the same time the one that sort of, you know, feels the greatest external threat. And it's this sort of paradox, and I don't think it's explained. I mean, there are some Russian historians who say, oh, well, they are under threat, and, you know, there are sort of enemies all around the borders, and I think that sort of doesn't get to the root of the problem, because it would need the enemies to be very threatening for that sort of response. But possibly it's to do with westernization. I mean, that's sort of that whole sort of history going back to Peter the Great, but even earlier than that, but sort of it was an ideological project under Peter the Great, and sort of fostered in ways which were actually quite authoritarian. Well, quite, doesn't need to qualify the word authoritarian. I mean, clearly it's a top-down project, and one which is kind of, you know, driven by personal rule to a large extent. And, you know, there was resistance is extremely difficult, and at the same time people do feel that, and so there are texts by Prince Mikhail Shebatov's on the ruination of morals in Russia, where part of the problem for him is that Russia's had a whole succession of women monarchs, which is the most terrible thing, and of course it's immediately to the ruination of morals, and I think he'd probably die if he could see this room with two women sort of addressing. And so food gets, it's sort of, as it were, it's hijacked to that, or it's brought into that project. I think it sort of doesn't start with a sort of food project. And then there's a sort of important commercial side to it. So when merchants in the late 18th century start protesting about importation of goods, of course it's rather similar to now, that they want to have their share of the market, which they see as being lost to others. And so the sort of the patriotic and the profitable actually in food are particularly close together. And then there's a power issue. So, I mean, Yevgeny Prigozhin, from that point of view, was a very interesting figure. I mean, something I was aware of before the private army thing became quite as germane to sort of current geopolitics as it was last year. Because he was getting catering contracts, he was not just getting catering contracts at the top end of Russian society, but getting contracts to supply food in school, and allegedly the quality of the food that was being supplied was not always the first, the very greatest sort of integration with the official rules. I mean, that's one of the things that's been alleged. So there is a sort of, you know, massive connection between power and patriotism and fear of the outside. And then there's a whole sort of communitarianism. In other words, people like the familiar, they want to share things. There's a nostalgia, very strong nostalgic culture in food. And actually also family recipes, so sort of things that one wouldn't see as particularly ideologically coloured, even one of a very stern kind of political analyst, are sort of part of food culture too. And it's sometimes seen as frivolous. I mean, I remember I was due to appear on an history platform, and somebody was giving a talk which is called, sort of politics and the mafia, the dark side of La Dolce Vita about Italy. So I called my talk metropole buns and the ballet, the lighter side of Leningrad. When I arrived, he changed his talk. His talk was given a different title because obviously I can reduce the value of the title. So, I mean, there is definitely a way in which this is seen as something which is not a very serious topic, and at the same time I would argue that it is, but not necessarily in a way that's sort of dry and incessant.
Yeah, I agree that whenever I mix food and politics in a sort of social media post, I often get sort of condescending comments saying, "Oh, honey, stick to food. Like, what do you know about politics, and what does food have to do with politics?" Where, of course, I just want to scream literally everything, and the big version is such a fascinating, horrific example of that. One, food and politics, and couldn't be more connected. In your book, you talk about conservatism and that Russian food culture is deeply conservative, and we've sort of covered that already in that resistance to the West. But then we have the phenomenon of the Soviet era and that social experiment where they literally had to invent a whole host of new dishes, new culinary customs, new culinary practices at home and in the public sphere, which, given the conservative nature of the country thus far, have been met with resistance. But could you talk us through, just kind of to give a context of how Russia has transitioned from its kind of Tsarist imperialist condition into this new social experiment called the Soviet Union?
Yes, I mean, I think the first thing I say is that Russian food culture was starting to change in quite significant ways already in the late 19th, early 20th century. And one really interesting source for sort of a sense of that is the reports of the so-called Ethnographical Bureau of Prince Vladimir Tenyshev. So these are reports which are being done by local ethnographers in villages who are talking about not just what people eat in villages. It's a sort of very broad sort of program of collecting sort of social information, but it includes information about food. And I mean, I've only made my way through about sort of 4 or 5 volumes. I mean, each volume is about 800 pages long. I mean, this is massive, and they've only kind of done about 6 or 7 kind of letters, I think, so far. So 15 volumes. I've looked at about 5 of them, but it's completely fascinating because it says things like, people in this village used not to eat potatoes 10 years ago, but now every peasant has got potatoes on their vegetable pouch. So there are sort of 3 narratives, and I've got a bit about each of them in the book. One of them is less about the rise of potatoes, because people talk about that so often, but the rise of tomatoes. So the fact that tomatoes start to be grown outside St. Petersburg in market gardens in a big commercial way in the 1890s. Then pigs, so pigs are not widely eaten. They're sort of partly taboo in some ways, but not uniformly. But they're not sort of as popular as the animal that's eaten more is the cow. I mean, beef cattle. And so, first of all, you get that, and you sort of encouragement to people to keep pigs on a sort of solo farmer basis. And then the Soviet period, the sort of intensive pig rearing is one of the sort of projects under collectivization, and it goes also with a very wide sort of meat factory building program. And what I wanted to do, people have talked a lot about the sausage, rather as though sausages had kind of dropped from the sky, and Mikoyan wanted to kind of everybody to eat sausage like the Americans, but how did the sausages get in the factory? And so I talked a bit about the sort of fact that the abattoir facility was part of these meat factories, and that, yes, horrible, and I mean, not as horrible as traditional killing though. And then the railway network is very important. It was again before 1917. People would bring in, there was actually a law that banned transport of live animals except by the railway system. And the railway system is very expensive, so there needs to be an incentive, but it's also a welfare criterion. And so that those had already happened, and what happens after 1917 is the state gets behind these projects. I mean, the state is far more involved in food provision at every level, including production, retailing, preparation of food, and the sort of standard basket of products is part of this. So it's a sort of acceleration of the sort of modernisation processes which were already happening before 1917, with a lot of state backing, and quite a lot of homogenisation, which is helped by cookbook production. So the one that everybody always talks about is the Book of Tasty and Nutritious Food, which first came out in 1939, but it's its 1952 edition, which is more important, and that sort of stabilises and then gets regularly reprinted, and there are enormous editions of 500,000, 1 million. But there are others as well, so there's a really important baking manual which came out first of all in, I think, 1959, so Chemgis and Merkel, which was actually written by two cooks from the Baltic states. So there's a sort of a transformation of, Russian-style Soviet food through, for instance, baking from the Baltic states, or these dishes such as Georgian harcho, which ends up on the sort of menu of a lot of ordinary canteens, but is originally a Georgian soup and so on. And at the same time, there's a sort of, it works the other way. So one of the disappointing things in the Soviet period is if you ended up going to somewhere like Armenia, was to discover that your hotel served quite a lot of fairly Soviet food. And certainly diaries, which are a wonderful resource. So there's a database called Prajito, which is a sort of Russian diary database, and that produces evidence about that. So people will say, we were staying in a hotel in Lake Sevan, but we didn't ever get any of the fish, which is so famous. We only had Armenian food when our hosts organised a feast in Yerevan, that sort of thing. So there's a kind of homogenisation. It sort of goes, again, with people moving into cities, convenience foods, all sorts of processes, transformation of cooking technology, when you get a cooker, when you get a fridge, that sort of thing.
You've mentioned Mikoyan, which is a fascinating figure, and of course his trip to the United States in the 30s has revolutionized what we understand by Soviet cuisine. I'd love for you to tell us more about him and the trip, what he brought back, and also the way that, I think so many people actually don't know about it at all, and they perceive those dishes that he brought back as those authentic, patriotic things. A really funny thing happened on Russian TV recently with the shutting down of the McDonald's, and Margarita Simonyan, who is one of the main propagandists, and she's constantly there just talking absolute rubbish, she said, well, we'll be just fine without McDonald's because we, in ancient Rus, says the Armenian person, knew how to fry kotlety. We'll be fine, thank you very much. And I posted that on Facebook saying, how ridiculous is this statement, because in fact, Mikoyan is to thank for the ancient Rus kotlety. And the amount of outrage that this post received from friends of friends, I don't know who those people were, they just could not accept the fact that kotlety are not quintessentially Russian. So please tell us about that, along with mayo and all the other wonderful ingredients that he has.
I think that kotlety are a little bit different from hamburgers because they usually contain bread. So, it's sort of thought to make it lighter. There are different ways of making meatballs. So they're more like Northern European meatballs in some respects. And actually, American hamburgers under Mikoyan didn't really catch on. But there is a sort of cast iron case that ice cream of the Soviet era was definitely based on American soft serve. That was sort of seen as the model, and they did very high quality versions of it. If you were lucky, one of the things I would say about the USSR, from having seen it in a third category provincial town, that the quality was inconsistent. So it wasn't necessarily true that every dish of Soviet ice cream you ever had was absolutely marvellous. You get very nice ice cream in a cafe in Voronezh, but the stuff sold on the street was sort of a bit more basic. It was kind of rather resistant briquettes, which quite nice and everything like that, but they certainly weren't gourmet fare. Yes, I think that, yes, it was. The number one thing that I talk about quite a lot is the salad. So the creation of what I sort of punningly call it, is a better pun in Russian, says stalat. So rather than salat, stalat. but a salad, yes, so a Stalin-era salad. And so what you're encouraged to do, I mean, a chopped vegetable salad certainly goes back to the 19th century, it's abundantly documented. And on the other hand, it wasn't eaten as widely, and it doesn't tend to be eaten at the start of the meal. So zakuski is something, these things that you have with vodka, with drinks at the beginning of the meal, usually didn't include these salads in the 19th century. It was often served as a buffet, and then it would be things that you could eat standing up comfortably. And then what they called salat was then often leaves, so it's sort of served after the meat course, so much more as it would have been in France. So that's a Western European tradition. And so what happens is these chopped salads are kind of introduced in a big way, often including the products. They're sort of light sausages, so things that haven't traditionally gone in their salads. And then it's the sort of arrival of, with a mega crash of the mayonnaise, bottle of mayonnaise. And it gets quite macabre. I mean, there's one sort of case that I quote from the diaries of Igor Dierkov, the writer, and he talks about Kostroma and how part of the I think ice or fell off a roof and actually killed some people who were starting their queue for mayonnaise. At which point people just moved away and continued to queue, sort of, leaving room for the sort of emergency workers to come in and remove the casualties. And it sounds, almost as if it had been made up. He's a pretty reliable witness. And equally, you get people saying, in their diaries, the necessities of life are no longer available. This is in sort of 1970s, 1980s, when food shortages become common, and especially in very well-provided towns where people would come in, as with Moscow, and come in from outside the city and buy as much as they could. So the necessities of life are very hard to get, and that includes mayonnaise. And I was thinking, how can mayonnaise be a necessity of life? Anyway, it was perceived like that. It's sort of, it's not funny, is it, where it sort of sounds quaint retrospectively, but at the time there's a lot of panic about this. Equally, when I worked on children's history, parents would be obsessed with getting tomatoes. There are other sources of vitamin C. Obviously, tomatoes are a very good source of vitamin C, but there are other sources. Oranges are also very difficult to get, but, vitamin C can be delivered in powdered form if necessary. It's one of the sort of forms of nutrition it's easiest to deal with. And at the same time, that sort of fixation on things, which becomes because they're short, I think that, and again, I remember that, it wasn't to do with food, but at the end of the time I was in Voronezh, I saw from the corner of my eye, from my fourth floor room, that somebody was selling lavatory paper down in the courtyard, and I was down there in 20 seconds. Even though I was about to leave the country, and I bought 10 rolls, which I then gave away, but it was sort of just, that dynamic, which almost becomes one that your conscious mind is not controlling. So a lot of very complicated things. I think not just about the arrival of strange products, because not every strange product was welcomed. A case of a product which definitely wasn't the sweet corn, yes, so anybody who knows anything about the Khrushchev era knows lots of jokes about kukuruza, yes, and about which part of Khrushchev resembled corn on the cob, and that kind of thing. And despite the fact that maize flour has been very widely eaten in Ukraine and Moldova, for example, it didn't catch on at all in Russia. And I think the fact that Khrushchev comes across as a sort of, if you like, a slightly foreign figure and a slightly ridiculous figure didn't help. But despite efforts to promote kukuruza, it didn't catch on at that point. And paradoxically, he returned as a sort of big thing when people started bringing in from Israel in tins. And it then becomes a shortage delicacy and starts getting introduced to salads. So there's kind of a lot of weird stuff about this, weird dynamics, which I like.
I'm sitting here looking at your gorgeous earrings.
Yeah. Everyone see them, they've got beetroots on them.
They're beetroots.
Beetroots, yes. They are, I bought them in the Fashion and Textile Museums, and as they typed up what they were, they said, oh, these are the statement earrings.
They certainly are. And then there's this gorgeous kapusta, the cabbage, on the cover of your book. And of course, to me, and I'm sure to many people, these, you would say, are quintessential Russian ingredients, but at the same time, they're a staple in most Eastern European diets.
Exactly.
And again, it kind of fascinates me, this confusion between Russian, Eastern European, especially Ukrainian cuisine and ingredients. Could you talk us through this kind of staples? I mean, I have my own list, but I was wondering what you would name in terms of vegetables, but also other products, and how do people within Russia perceive them as well? Is there that sense of the borders are permeable, and of course ingredients travel around the world? Is there that awareness of sort of the history behind the food that is consumed on a daily basis? And I understand that obviously asking people in Russia, it's such a huge term. Of course, they're very different people in Russia, but kind of from your vast experience of traveling through Russia for so many years and consistently, kind of how do you perceive people's understanding of these sort of quintessential ingredients, but how do they connect to the other countries as well?
Yes, I mean, it's a really good question, and I suppose, the book is organised by food products, so the first chapter is about grain and bread, and then I then go on to meat and milk, because they're connected, you can't have one without the other. Then I have chapters on fishing, game, and berries, cakes and sweets, and honey cakes and sweets. I think I probably left something out, but anyway, you'll see. And starting with grain, it's obvious because there's a really strongly sacral character to grain and bread in lots of parts of Eurasia, and that's not exceptional because one gets that in the Middle East as well, and sort of most parts of the world there's an attachment to bread, and obviously sort of major religions have also consolidated that and underwritten it. And I think I would say there's a sort of sense of that bread was Sovietized remarkably successfully. The bread factories started to be mechanized in the late 1920s, early 1930s. And they were very proud of their conveyor belt system. That's really for nerds, but anyway, that was, there's plenty for nerds in this. But there was also the issue of recipes, what recipes they used for bread. And thank God, rather than consulting what the Americans were doing, they got in German recipes for bread. So that was a really fortunate development. And Soviet industry produced bread in peacetime and in times when there weren't really severe shortages, was very high quality. And actually one of the differences between Ukraine and Russia, when I was last in Ukraine in 2019, was that you could still get Soviet-style factory bread. There was still a state-controlled bread industry, which unfortunately is one of the things that the current catastrophic economic situation seems to be undermining, because the quality of bread was exceptionally high, and it was quite embarrassing. I asked in a rather touristy restaurant in central Kiev where they got their delicious bread, and she looked very embarrassed. And the next thing is I walked into an ordinary shop, and there was exactly that bread. And that's a wonderful situation to be in. And then, so there are different types of bread, obviously. So there's a sort of a rye bread, which is eaten in some places. Historically, probably hasn't been eaten as widely as sometimes people suppose, because according to sort of, at least the scanty data that I've seen, that in Archangels, for instance, they were importing grain in the 18th century, and there are parts of northern Russia where barley and oats were probably grown more widely. People ate birch bark bread in parts of northern Russia in sort of in hard times. But anyway, that's sort of the whole concept of bread. A lot of argument about whether flatbreads, so lipyoshka, whether that is actually bread or it's some sort of abomination, which no Russian would stomach, although Russian peasants regularly made it, and it's a regular hardship thing because it's much easier to make a low yeast or a no yeast sort of bread than it is to make something where it might spoil. So yes, there's an awful lot around that. Then, as I said, some milk products, although kefir is actually something that historically is from much further east than the heartlands of Russia. But if you kind of live in remote places, you haven't necessarily got market sales very easily for milk. Milk is highly seasonal, then it makes a lot of sense to sour it, and then of course people like sour milk products. They do in Ireland, by the way, as well. That's a sort of difference between Ireland and southern England. So buttermilk is the standard sort of form of milk, which is used for baking. People like rather high butter. So farmhouse butter in Ireland, I must say that despite having been to Ireland a lot since I was this relatively small child, I really did not like Irish country butter very much at all. It does taste rancid to me, but absolutely delicious to people there. So I think there are particular takes on those products. And then when it comes to vegetables, I mean, I mentioned that there's a much wider selection of vegetables which would be regularly eaten in the south of Russia and Ukraine than in northern Russia, I mean, just because of the nature of the growing season. But cabbage grows and it's very widely eaten, and I think people are more enthusiastic about cabbage. I mean, all I can say is once I made a Russian cabbage pie at home when I was probably about 17. My father said, "Oh God, cabbage pie, that really does speak volumes about peasant distress." I was terribly offended. I made this delicious pie that was in a completely buttery crust, cooked in butter with eggs in it, and nobody in the family was prepared to take a very active interest in this pie. So I think, there really is a sense that a decent cabbage, and I sort of picked cabbage for the front cover. I mean, partly picked that image because it shows somebody who's actually been growing it, and I wanted the sort of the growing side to be in there, but the cabbage also, and the sort of fermenting tradition about which you've written so wonderfully in your book, among other things, is related to this. And so again, not unique to Russia. There's a lot of argument about whether Kvashena kapustas, the sauerkraut equivalent, is actually something that came in the 18th century, whether it existed earlier, but they certainly fermented. There's certainly an entire fermenting microsystem in kitchens. I mean, the Domostoy tells you that you use, your kind of sourdough, sour bread, but it's also used to make kvass, and then sort of used to make the, sort of kvass is used to make vegetables that are put down and put up in crust, etc. So, and then beyond that, it becomes more problematic because it does sort of vary a lot from period to period, I think. So I don't know what your sort of hit list would be of.
Well, it's something that I've been grappling with because I was going to work on a cookbook just before the war broke out. I was going to travel across Russia on the Trans-Siberian Express. And before I went, well, I couldn't go because of the war, but I've done quite a bit of research just, on the internet and reaching out to people through Instagram, different producers, and just asking people, about their heritage and their backgrounds. And it's really fascinating to find that it's just so diverse that I really couldn't pinpoint what is Russian food. I was like, how am I going to write this book? Because honestly, my conclusion was that there is no such thing as Russian food. It's a really, fascinating and a very complicated mix of all sorts of things. But then, at the same time, it's a question of kind of how far back in history do you go? So one thing that I would say, two things that you could argue are quintessentially Russian are pelmeni.
Yes.
But then again, there are two versions of where pelmeni come from. And one is from the Ural Mountains, from Udmurt community, which is not ethnically Russian, and the other one is, of course, the Chinese Mongolian root, which is again not Russian. And then we have shi, which is the sour cabbage or fresh cabbage soup, and I think that's potentially the only dish that I could think of or have researched and found that kind of has that label of authentic cuisine. And it's quite funny that I really want to talk about borscht as well, and it's quite funny that in Ukraine, it's often used as a derogatory, she is like a derogatory kind of term, and there's a picture of that chef, Yevgen Klopotenko, who is sort of dressed in a traditional Ukrainian outfit. It's a drawing of him, and he is sitting with a bowl of borscht, and then he is warming his feet in a bowl of shi. So you kind of get the point. So I think the pelmeni and shi would be my sort of contenders for the authentic Russian dishes. Other than that, I can literally trace everything else to other places. And
I mean, what we haven't talked about so far is regional factors.
Yes.
We haven't talked about that much, and we talked a little bit about northern Russia, and there's an interesting book by Dara Goldstein about North Russian food, which is great. I mean, she's worked with local historians there, and it does introduce dishes which are really not widely known at all, and it's a different picture. And your book was really interesting among many other reasons because you've got Siberian recipes in it, and Siberia is not Russia, and I have a quotation from Kropotkin, who visited Siberia, and says, they like sour things here, their bread's very sour, and you think, oh yes, well then, that there's a difference. In other words, that's sourdough, and actually in Russian tradition, sourdough has just been, used essentially for a bit of flavouring, but it's yeast which is used for the lift, so it's not a pure sourdough tradition at all, and so if you find sourdough in Russia, it tends to be in Californian-style new wave restaurants. So that's another factor, and yes, if people won't eat mushrooms in certain places that other people think are wonderful. So I've got a friend who's from Arkhangelsk and said that I can't believe the mushrooms that people around here will gather. It's really suspicious mushrooms that nobody in the north would touch. And I suspect that possibly historically the issue was that people in the north ate a lot of mushrooms, and so if they ate suspicious mushrooms in any quantity, it could have fatal results, and so they might be therefore much more careful about what sorts they eat. So I think that's right. As we come back to borscht and shri, I want to take sides on a lot of things about Russia versus Ukraine, but I think with that, I'd be delighted to eat either shri or borscht. And I think it's fair enough to say that Russians have made beetroot soups for a long time. Beetroot is mentioned in the Danazatlois, it's mentioned, it was known in the 16th century. It's just whether the soup was called borscht or not, and whether the soup called borscht actually included beetroots is a bit more problematic. And borscht in, I think, Romanian-speaking countries doesn't necessarily mean a beetroot soup, so it can be a sort of sour soup. It's also fair to say there are different borscht traditions, because I have friends in St. Petersburg from a Jewish household, and so I remember being told that there's Jewish borscht, which is characterised by the fact that you add sugar to it. So there are different styles of eating it, and then it's a question of what meat you might put in, what other vegetables are there, and so it's not necessarily one soup. And I completely see why the Ukrainians, and this comes back to the point that Alissa was making, when your culture's under threat, you become protective of cultural values, and I can see why the Ukrainians want borscht in UNESCO piece of sort of intangible heritage, or should it be tangible? That's another kind of issue with food, is it tangible or intangible? But on the other hand, as somebody who's worked on culinary history, I think this is sort of a bit of a non-debate, to be honest, because it sort of exists in both places. What I would say is that in Russian early 19th century cookbooks, Avdyeeva's 1842 cookbook, for example, is described as a little Russian dish, so that's sort of now a rather offensive term about Ukraine. So it's sort of seen at that stage as a Ukrainian dish, and something has been imported. Has been thoroughly naturalised since then, but there you were.
The other thing that's typical, I'd say, of Russian attitude to food is the nostalgia that you've spoken about. And it's interesting that I think it was probably around 10 years ago, it felt like there was a real revival of pre-revolutionary cuisine, and there were so many young chefs following very much kind of a wider discourse around food of like locally produced, kind of going back to the roots, reviving old style grains or plants, and essentially a really wonderful, beautiful project for the ecology and cultural understanding of one's roots and so on. And I remember in Chef's Table, an episode dedicated to Vladimir Mukhin, the head chef of White Rabbit, and which back then was a fascinating thing. I think what Mukhin's doing now is just becoming a horrendous example of cultural appropriation, but we'll talk about it maybe a bit later. But back then, in this episode of Chef's Table, he was talking about his work and this fascination with pre-revolutionary Russian cuisine, going to monasteries and really seeing the monasteries as kind of the birthplace of cuisine. This is where you go to find authentic stuff. And then talking about Soviet era And I think, pardon me, he used the word говно, talking about the food, so shit. Soviet food is shit, and it was a real violation of, everything that food was about. And I'm here to, bring back the real Russian stuff. And I think he didn't succeed much on that at all. How do we grapple with this, which I think is an impossible project, to sort of ignore 70 years of history, go back to something else, and then sort of jump over those 70 years and expect people to just take to it. And so how does that work in the Russian context of nostalgia? Where does Soviet food sit? And where does pre-revolutionary sort of monastery traditions, religious traditions come into that as well?
Yeah, I mean, there's one sort of obvious comparison here, which is what British food went through in the 1960s, 1970s. And I mean, I think it's not that well known outside Britain, certainly not in Russia, that there was 15 years of rationing in Britain between 1939 and 1954, and it really did change the way people ate. In some ways it was actually quite positive, because it produced a sort of a rather more even sort of food distribution, sort of nutritional thresholds improved, and you would sort of still see the result of that, really. I mean, in my own childhood, I think sort of average health of children was better. You didn't get kids with rickets, which is sort of seemed like something out of Victorian era, is now very real in some parts of the country. And so I think the problem is that what's ignored about the Soviet period is the sort of effort to ensure some sort of better nutrition for the masses, and that's not a bad project in some ways. And the trouble is, when a sort of elite Moscow chef sort of says, "Oh, it was all absolute shit," it ignores the fact that nutritional thresholds for some, if you like, economically constrained sectors of the population, particularly for pensioners, have got much worse. And I don't know about child nutrition in post-Soviet Russia, because I think it would be difficult. There probably aren't any non-classified serious studies of this, but it wouldn't be at all surprising if that profile had got worse. So that's one comment on it. If we're sort of coming at it from the connoisseurship side, that's one side that's very common in food writing about is it delicious? Is it rarefied? Can lots of people get it? If so, then it's probably not great. So there's a really strong food fashion thing in Russia as well. So I think all of those factors are there. What I would also say is there's a paradox that people who are producing authentic food, and I don't think it applies so much to Walking because I think he did have his own farm, but it's actually quite difficult to produce the sort of food that you need to run an authentic restaurant in today's Russia, because, you can start with the fact that one of the things I do know a bit about is that most of the kind of breeds of cattle, pigs, and so on in modern Russia are actually crossbred with Western types. So, the large white English pig is very present in the genetics of the Russian pig. So it's not the same pig as people were eating in the 19th century, yes, except in places which were doing sort of breed improvement. So there's an issue with that, and there's also the fact that when you looked at the online offerings of these sort of top-of-the-range places like Lavka in Moscow, you notice that, for example, they have very few sorts of fish on offer, including you can't really get pike perch, which is very widely eaten in Russia. Why? Because a lot of it used to be imported before 2014, when the imposition of counter-sanctions. So to produce an authentic Russian table, you need to be able to import food from outside Russia a lot of the time. In the same way that people in this country have sort of found, since it became much more difficult to import stuff, let's not talk about why, but it's that it becomes more difficult to make kind of some types of traditional English food as well. So it's not a question that you kind of close borders and then immediately the authenticity wells up from the ground. There's rather a wonderful story of a farmer saying in 2014, saying, Mr. Putin, it takes a cow 2 years to have a calf, and you can't just increase meat production like that. I mean, it's just it's a process that just doesn't work in the way that a lot of city people do. And Russia has got, I do think it does, and a lot of course, Russia's been characterised since throughout the 20th century by a really dramatic drop in rural population. And so the result is lots of people don't understand the farming process. I mean, even in the 1980s, so I was in Russia, in Voronezh in 1980 to 1981, I had a roommate who came from sort of what's called a рабочий поселок, so a sort of, a settlement around a small factory, kind of right out in the middle of nowhere, and she'd never seen a cow. The cows were all indoors. Nobody usually worked on a collective farm. She'd never been to a farm. She was far more out of touch with kind of, if you like, farming reality that a lot of people in, kind of some parts of the home counties would be, because it's just a different setup. So I think there's a real issue with this, and it's not just about kind of, making kulibiaka from kind of river salmon for sort of 200 people in a leading Moscow restaurant.
We're coming to, I think, close to an end, and I want to leave space for people to ask questions. So, gosh, I still have so many things I didn't ask you, but I'll try to sort of sum it up in my final question, which would be about the future of Russian cuisine and food culture in general. Of course, we are, finding ourselves now in midst of this ongoing horrific war, the sanctions, the ecocide in Ukraine, the holding grains hostage, and so on. At the same time, Putin gives his horrific, endless annual addresses, where he talks about the beautiful multicultural country and how that manifests in so many wonderful ways. Of course, food is a big part of that. That there are all these beautiful regional voices, and of course, the sort of Soviet past is still very much present on the Russian table. But and then he goes on to quote from the ultra-nationalist philosopher Ilyin, talking about Russians are the people, and of course you understand it's this whole notion of multiculturalism is complete phony statement. There is no such thing as multiculturalism, and sadly my perception is that Russian food is a result of years and years of colonization and cultural appropriation, and I wish I had a more positive way of seeing the cuisine that I grew up with, that I write about, that I feel passionate about, but at the same time the current climate just doesn't allow me to see anything positive about the present or the future, and I can't even imagine where that future is going, so I would love for you to tell us your thoughts about it.
It's a really complicated problem. I think what I would say about this is I probably feel less. I don't have the particular issue of being brought up in the food culture, feeling responsible for it, and that doesn't absolve the outside commentator responsibility, because clearly you've got to engage with it. There is a problem. I had a sort of issue. I got to the end of writing this book, and it had been a lot of fun to write, it had been a lot of fun to research, and then suddenly there was very serious evidence, as you say, of kind of grain theft, for example, and what does one do? I've written about that in the conclusion to some extent. But I think what I would say is there's a link between current policy and the sort of assumption that the entire territory sort of belongs to Russia, and that you've got both before 1917, so the sort of exploitation of the steppe territories, for example, in fact, and a lot of grain was grown on territories which weren't historically Russian. Mass importation of cattle from Central Asia, although it has to be said that was about paying quite high prices to quite demanding sellers. Judging by the evidence of the time, that people knew the value of their cattle, and it wasn't a question of the fact that they were just sort of selling for the lowest possible price. So if one sees the entire history as always about being an exploitation of subordinate peoples, it gets a bit problematic. It also gets problematic in the Soviet period because there were local administrators who were actually from the so-called titular nationalities. So you get that in D. Mohammed Korayev's memoirs, for example. So he was the long-term first secretary of Kazakhstan, and he says how proud he is that Kazakhstan is feeding Russia. So to be able to feed is a position of power from his point of view. And so that, obviously has sort of changed significantly since the end of the Soviet period, because it's gone to, from a kind of enormous internal market to a sort of series of near abroad different markets, and a lot of sort of borders need to be crossed. And I think it's been a shock for people to get used to the fact that these impotent people who used to supply the cities are kind of now not doing it. And okay, they're overcharging us for them. And there's an awful lot of suspicion about food. I mean, you get it in the Soviet period when there were so-called, kind of questions from the floor. So a Communist Party instructor would go to a factory, and these usually, by the way, were not sort of people who were operating on lathe, they were very often engineers, and they would kind of, put up their hand and say, why is all our butter going to Zimbabwe or whatever? In other words, the idea is that Russia is always giving the world its produce, and it's always having that taken. And even if this was based on rumour, on complete absence of factual information, nobody ever put up their hand and said, why are we taking food from Mozambique's fishing grounds, for example, although there's evidence of that happening. It's always, why is our butter going to Mozambique? So it's kind of, it's that sort of background. And I mean, again, I think one probably has to look back to probably 1940s and 1950s Britain to find an analogy about kind of the way people looked at former parts of the empire at that stage. I mean, it's after all relatively recent, the sort of whole Soviet collapse. And there's a lot of mythology about it. I mean, not in the food world, but I remember talking to a very well-known Russian film director who I happen to know because I'd read the Communist Party records of the studio he worked in, had been spearheading market relations, wanting to sort of make blockbusters. And was saying to me in sort of 2015, 2016, the Americans came in and they took our film industry away. I felt like saying that was actually you who decided that you wanted a different film industry, and the Americans came in because you wanted that kind of film industry. And again, I think the food culture has changed because people wanted something different. They were sick of shortages. They thought Western food was better. There's a lot of kind of, I think, rather starry-eyed feeling about that. So they discovered to their surprise that mass market chocolate from Western sources wasn't as good as gourmet Russian chocolate. Well, what a surprise, but it was a surprise, of course. So, very complicated. I don't think you should feel too guilty on the behalf of your culinary culture for this. I mean, I think it's a much larger global problem than this. I mean, look at the way Americans regard their food history, or we do. Taking our stuff for granted. It's a complex problem.
Yeah, and I was thinking about that, in terms of, say, Indian food in Britain. Of course, it's considered national cuisine, but of course, if Britain were to start an aggressive war in India, then I'm sure native Indian people in India would not feel great about curry being suddenly, being seen as common and national within the country that is attacking them. But yes, it definitely has. The war has made it's just put a whole new lens on for so many people from within Russia. I guess if you do belong to that group of people who don't agree with the war, it's a very interesting and very difficult lens to see your past and your present through. I remember that the first New Year's Eve, when the war was happening, I made a very deliberate choice not to do any of the classic Soviet-era salad olivier, even though it has been a tradition in my family. I just couldn't bring myself to knowingly cook something that people who are waging the war in Ukraine would be eating. It just felt like I just couldn't stomach it quite literally. But I think we need more time, I guess, to see how it unravels and hopefully find a more kind of forgiving lens to look at that country and the culinary heritage, because of course it's a very fascinating place. So I think I'm gonna now open to questions.
I need to steal one of your microphones.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yes, we have a question there, I think.
I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about the impact of the introduction of the market economy on Russian cuisine sort of in the 90s. I know you touched briefly on kind of the fleeting existence of McDonald's in Russia and the traditional chocolate, but could you expand on that a bit more, please?
Yes, I haven't mentioned McDonald's. I say a very little bit about it in the book, for the main reason that in a lot of US sources it gets treated as if it's the only fast food in Russia, and it's not the only Western chain, and sort of never was. And they have Burger King as well, for what it's worth. But I mean, also Pizza not I think Pizza Express, but they have pizza chains. I mean, pizza is also a very popular fast food. Has traditionally been a popular fast food, and to the extent that sort of Georgian flatbreads are now marketed as sort of, Georgian Ossetian pizza. I mean, so that's things that were familiar in the Soviet period and now promoted as that. I'm not an expert on this. I mean, there's sort of, there are people who've done much more work on the 90s and what's happening at that stage. But, I mean, I know a certain amount from first-hand observation. So, I mean, there's another chain that came in, was Penguin Ice Cream, and that was, all over the place. Actually, when I was in Tartu in 1990, that was being sold, and it was not particularly good. I think they watered it down, and it didn't really taste very good at all. But that's not to say that it wouldn't sort of made properly. So it was about kind of a real boom in imported food products and hyper-processed imported food products. McDonald's sort of stood out because apparently they had their own farming facilities. So it was sort of, if you like, a very sort of weird example of farm to table. I mean, one would probably associate McDonald's with farm to table in most places, but apparently that's what happened. I mean, Christy Ironside, who works at McGill University in Montreal, is very interested in McDonald's, writing a book about it, so she'll write a terrific book. She's an economic historian. So, aside from that, I mean, yes, otherwise what happened is steak shops still existed. They were very much like they had been. I mean, often sort of shop level, and I was reminded actually by reminiscences of somebody who's quite a bit younger than me, so there's somebody called, I think, Craig Ashton, who writes a lot on Facebook and blogs about kind of his experiences in Russia, kind of arriving, knowing plenty of Russian, but no practical Russian, and going into shops and trying to talk to people across the counter. And I had no idea that in 2003 there were still places where you had to talk to someone across the counter, and I started thinking about it, and maybe there were. So it didn't change all that rapidly. So that sort of side of that, infamous Soviet food culture, which meant queuing up, sort of petitioning the person behind the counter for something, then going and paying for it. And then he used to sort of short-circuit it by going and getting the receipt first, but then if it was, it turned out you'd been cut slightly more, then you had to kind of deplatit, so you had to give back to the cash till again. And so, what's available, the whole service culture, that was another really important thing that changed. As I say, the presence of sort of Western companies, both in retailing and also in sort of, the food supply and so on, those were all major changes. And then for a lot of people also, doing much more active work in growing vegetables in the dacha, because they had actually to survive. I mean, this was happening in the Urals when it was 2003 in the Ekaterinburg. The family I stayed with, the two sort of middle-aged adults, were spending all Saturday and Sunday growing food in the dacha. And that was supposed to be what happened, because that was always a condition of having a sort of market garden, but actually it didn't a lot of the time. People might grow a few flowers. It really was a big thing in the 90s, and those are sort of all important features of the period. Yes, we have. Next time I'll try and take a question from this side, because I know that often people seem to have gone blind in one eye.
Going back to food and politics, I remember a few years ago, Boris Johnson's Brexit being asked what his favourite choice was, either fish and chips or chicken tikka masala. And I just wonder what Putin would say if you got asked the same question.
It's an interesting question, and it's been quite amusing to look at sort of Kremlin menus and sort of see that actually, I think it's pavlova, which is allegedly invented. I mean, there's a lot of argument about whether it was Australia or New Zealand, but it seems to be one or the other. So pavlova's now become something that's perceived as Russian, certainly case in point, and presumably he likes it because otherwise one has to assume it wouldn't be on the menu. He was renowned for liking sushi at one stage, and I was being told that in the 90s, early 2000s. I mean, I know nothing about Putin that I haven't been told at second and third hand. I mean, it's, I've never met him, etc. And I'm sure both of us are equally glad of that. So I think, I suspect, to be honest, he's not that interested in food. I mean, he's not much of a drinker either. I mean, I think that doesn't really sort of seem to be genuinely the case. And then, on the other hand, there are obviously members of the Russian elite, and I think Dmitry Medvedev is a big case in point, who are much more of the sort of bon vivant kind, and he's supposed to be very enthusiastic about French wine. Let's go no further than that. I don't know. I mean, I think there are, lots of different tastes now. And one thing that was very striking with the sanctions in 2014 is that Parma ham was formally exempted. So there were some high-range products. I mean, several of them Italian. I think Parmesan cheese was something else. Swiss cheese, of course, was allowed also. So it was not just EU products, it was EEA products, so from Norwegian fish was banned. So I think that probably also tells you something about what people like. And on the other hand, of course, it's a point of pride to, at least say that people are feeling very enthusiastic. And one of the things, again, I talk about is that actually, when I went to Voronezh in 2018, it was transformed out of all recognition and had this food market that had just won a prize as the best sort of shopping centre in the whole of Russia, and it did have very, very impressive shops. So, there was a sort of stage when, at least in some places, there was a sort of boost of the food culture. The other thing that was very funny, I mean, Voronezh, when I was there, you couldn't get meat in the state shops at all. And Voronezh is now the brand name for a chain of steakhouses, and very widely well thought of steakhouses, very popular with Russian politicians, patriotic politicians, let's call that. So there has been a sort of transformation, but other than that, I can't really say. Yes.
I wonder if you could say a little bit about ownership of farmland, a little bit about that, and what happened to the kolkhozes, avkhozi. I remember when we were there in the 90s, we used to walk past fields, and our Russian friends would just say, well, there used to be a sovkhoz here, but now it's abandoned. Do you know what happened? Who owns farms nowadays?
Well, to answer this sort of question, you want a political geographer. I mean, somebody like Judith Pallow at the University of Oxford, and again, it's something which I just know about from second hand. But it seems to, from little I know, to have sort of split between places where the land is essentially not farmed and places where agribusiness has moved in. So I don't think there have been many successful kind of management buyouts of former state farms and collective farms. I think either it's sort of barely holding together, and that was certainly what it looked like in the Urals when I was there in the early 2000s, although that's quite a long time ago, or places where obviously there's been a real transformation of the grain growing landscape, and Russia is now way up, probably the top grain producer in the world, yes, and top exporter. Unlike the late Soviet period when grain was being brought in from America, so there was a sort of an awful joke about vodka, and how it was Kolos Ameriki, so from Plan, Kolos Ameriki, which is Voice of America station, and Kolos Ameriki, the kind of the sort of corn head of America. And lots of other things. I mean, something else somebody was asking about the other day was other imported food, and apart from American chicken, I can remember seeing boxes from Anchor butter in Moscow in 1981. Nobody liked it because it was salted, so that was quite interesting. But to come back to the question you were actually asking, that's as much as I can say. That that's my impression of what's happened, rather than being a specialist on this at all. Yes.
Thanks for the conversation. So my mom talks about getting caviar in like 3-liter bottles when she was a kid in Rostov. Can you talk about caviar and how it's perceived as such a luxury food in the West and what it means for Russians?
Yeah, I think one of the things is it's a luxury food in Russia now. Yes, I mean, unless you live somewhere where it's, you might get a 3-liter jar of caviar because it's actually sort of, there's some sort of facility which you live next to. But even then, I mean, sort of the catastrophic decline in sturgeon harvest has really made big changes. So I think a lot of caviar comes from Iran now, and in a way, it's kind of mythologized, but it was certainly true that it didn't cost a whole lot to get a caviar open sandwich somewhere like, in an opera house. Probably not that much more than a ticket to the opera, because those were also, relatively cheap if you went very high up at that stage. And there was a sort of stage when it was quite like that. I mean, I had a Russian friend who was very hard up, and I used to try and help out, and I have found sort of, places I could sort of leave money without her being able to object to it. And she would kind of, buy me a kind of a treat of some caviar as a sort of way of feeling less embarrassed about the situation. And at one stage she used to buy sort of small jars of black caviar, so it was sort of, manageable at that level. And then she used to buy red caviar after that, because the black caviar had got far too expensive even in small quantities. And we're talking about the late 90s, early 2000s, that transition. But yeah, I mean, there are Hedrick Smith, I think, talks about in his book, The Russians, about going to sort of see people for dinner, and there was a small child who was being fed caviar as something nutritious, and of course detested it. And all the adults sat around sort of slavering whilst the small child kind of ate this caviar sandwich at dagger point. So it was a very different substance, and as I say, yes, I mean, totally transformed now. I mean, something that very few people can afford to buy. And something else, it's not quite in the same category, I think it's probably more esoteric at the time, is Kamchatka crab, which is sort of tinned. Some of it sold on the Soviet market was actually in tins which had foreign handwriting because it was exported, so some of the exported, the stuff was supposed to be exported would end up on the Soviet market. But that now is a really sort of big luxury thing, and you go to high-end places where these unfortunate creatures are in tanks, kind of, there is a Russian phrase for lachit zhalkas, which is the so dragging out a weary existence, which I always think of when I see one of these unfortunate creatures in a tank about a metre wide. It's a terrible sight. But that's something else. I think I worked out that was even more expensive than caviar. And so yes, and these things are sort of, absolute luxury goods now. And I'm expecting argument, because normally what happens you talk about food is there's 40 people in the room and 40 different opinions, and somebody stands up and says loudly, you're talking rubbish. So please, if you think I'm talking rubbish, do stand up and say something. It won't be the first time. Oh, somebody thinks I'm talking rubbish.
Oh, thanks for the talk. And my question is about authenticity. Actually, I have two. But the first question is about authenticity. So how you touched upon this, and especially when Alissa was talking about, this chef going back to the pre-revolutionary, and Catriona was commenting on this. But for you, what is authenticity? Is authenticity something that you can trace through the kind of memory of several generations, or authenticity is something that you as historians can trace through the sources, and as far as the sources, your sources will go? That's the first question. And the second, if I may, is a fun one. I was waiting for either of you to mention buckwheat.
Right. Yes. Maybe start with the second one. I mean, yes, buckwheat is definitely very important. And I think probably more significant though than it might have been, because it was something that got very short at the end of the Soviet period. So that's something else that people write a lot in their diaries about, no longer being able to get gryechka. And And it's also something that when people leave Russia, it's more difficult to get. I mean, you can get buckwheat in this country, but it's not necessarily exactly the same. And so it then becomes a big thing to say, sort of share information about where you can buy buckwheat, because people sort of, feel homesick, and then that's one of the things they miss. About authenticity again, it's a sort of complicated question. It's probably not going to be a terribly satisfactory answer, but the thing I wanted to start with was actually talking about food authenticity and integrity just from the point of view that it's not contaminated. Because very often people sort of suppose that that's a function of the modern era, and then you look at domestic manuals from the late 19th century and they say, I quoted one from Maria saying, never has food been so insolently falsified as it is in our time. And then she talks about people adding chalk to milk. Not just watering it down, but kind of, so it doesn't go blue, you add some chalk. Really horrible things. And then there's all the problems with ergotism, for example, so that traditionally rye has been a really problematic crop because it's highly subject to ergot, so there's highly toxic, neurotoxic fungus. And Tolstoy talks a bit about this, about the problem of, in Spain, I think is the Russian for it, about having to actually pick it out individually from grains and actually go through the crop and pick it over. And then there's kind of also all the joys of TB, brucellosis and so on in milk, pre-pasteurization. Milk actually wasn't all that widely pasteurized in the Soviet period either, which is great if you wanted to make twarog, so this curd cheese. You need to go to again, something very expensive from these tested herbs and so on in this country, but it's kind of widely available in standard shops. So there's that side of things as well. So I think people would normally assume that authentic food was healthy, but at the same time historical food wasn't necessarily healthy. They sort of tend to assume that recipes have sort of been handed down without being changed, but at the same time they do change, and the same name doesn't necessarily apply to the same thing. And then also, taste change, means that they change where people move. So all of that makes it quite problematic. So, I think this is, almost, without being offensive, I put them the other way around, that this is the fun questions. This is the question you can't answer. This is the question that's not a serious question. And so, I would kind of think, if I wanted to sort of give people a taste of Russian food, what I would put on the table and what I wouldn't put on the table. So I wouldn't put salted butter on the table, for instance. I wouldn't put kind of cream desserts that were made with alcohol on the table, because I know I've had Russian friends who say they think they're completely horrible, and these are traditional, English desserts, cinnamon, for example. Roast meat would be absolutely fine, sort of done in the British style. It doesn't differ all that much. That kind of thing. In other words, something that sort of struck people as what they were used to. And sometimes one sort of cooks that. I can remember a Russian poet, Yevgeny Rain, getting very offended because we'd made turnip soup, and he said, "I can't eat this stuff, it's for cattle." So one gets used to that sort of situation of people being really, really thinking it matters, and obviously not having been brought up with a sort of rule that operated. My mother didn't make us eat things. She had a rule that if you didn't like it, you got nothing else, but you didn't have to eat it. But if we ever went out, we were not allowed to say we didn't like something. So of course it's been a bit of a shock to have people kind of say, "Oh, I can't eat that mucky chicken." But I'm now used to this, and I've tried to cater for that. So I think that's changed though. So younger Russians are not like that. Younger Russians are extremely curious about food, and actually I remember seeing a sort of very obviously Russian comment because of the very Russian English about a restaurant in London, which has been a big disappointment because I ate nothing I had not eaten before. So that was the evaluation model. Yes. Yes, we have a question.
This will be the last question. Okay.
Well, great pressure. My memories of Russian food, the first time I went to Russia was in the early 90s, is really most issues an absence of strong flavours. If you wanted, strong flavours or spice, you went to a Georgian restaurant or an Uzbek restaurant or a Ukrainian restaurant, for example. But Stalova was quite sort of bland, generally delicious. Smetana and butter and pelmeni, etc. But absence of those strong flavours. And then in the sort of 2000s, it's now in almost every single dish, everything started coming with dill. And is now, all pervasive. Why is that? Why was dill so popular?
Right, there's a Facebook group which is called Dill Watch.
Oh.
Started by foreigners. It's dormant now. Occasionally the last time I contributed to it was December 2021 when I went to Pskov and I had a Greek salad and it was covered with dill. It was fine. I like dill. Don't tell anybody on Dill Watch because I get kicked off it. But I like dill. But it is the sort of the tendency to sort of put it on everything. Yes, and it doesn't look very nice. A rather unsuitable joke I remember sort of making about this was. Toast a la Brazilienne, from the depiction procedure when somebody put a load of sort of strands of dill on the top of this toast. It looked quite horrible. But I think the dill has sort of always been there, but it had a niche which was often for pickling, yes, so that it's been there in pickling, not sort of, strewn far and wide over absolutely everything, and certainly not to the same extent sort of put on every type of sort of, Uzbek or Georgian food as well. I think it's completely right about sort of, if you like, wanting food to taste the main ingredients. And I have a wonderful recipe. I've actually got recipes on the internet, so the book has kind of got a link to the site that has them. So you can find one of the recipes is for batvinia, so this soup which is made with beet leaves. And Olga Solokhova, who's a very distinguished poet, gave me this recipe, and you sort of look at it as a sort of a British person, and you think, well, I'll try this soup, but it's got water in it, it's got beetroot, it's got carrots, it's got onions, and you fry off the carrots. You cook the onion and the beet, and then you actually add the beet leaves and so on, cook it in the soup, and you fry off the carrots and butter. It's the most delicious thing. It's just that the sort of taste of the fresh vegetables cooked in butter. They have to be really good vegetables. So one of the things I've said in the instructions to the recipes, Russian food is relatively technically straightforward. You don't need to worry about your cutting skills as much. You certainly need to chop a lot, so if it's the salads, then rake the family in, that's what everybody does. But you do need really fresh produce. Fresh is one of the sort of, the central part of the vocabulary of appreciation, and people will ask in shops, is it fresh? And smell things to make sure they're fresh, feel them, and so on, if it's in markets. And markets, unfortunately, are dying in Moscow and St. Petersburg, with possible exception of geometry, certainly in St. Petersburg, they're dying. But people do the same sort of things in supermarkets or, premium shops and so on. Or I suppose now when they get their vegetable boxes delivered by a courier, which is way more and more people are buying. So I think that's completely true. And on the other hand, people do like pickles. There's a sort of separate thing. So they do like tikka mamali sauce, Georgian sauce. It's a bit like, again, traditional English food. So people loved sort of gentleman's relish. They loved Worcester sauce. At the same time, they didn't like garlic. So it's sort of similar to that. And yeah, that would be how I would sum it up, really.
We've just got one more quick question from one of our audience who's watching on YouTube. So she's asked, what did the average cooker look like around 1953, and what sort of energy was used to heat it?
Well, I think even at that stage, for quite a lot of people, the average cooker would have been a primer stone, yes? So that the mass gasification of Russian cities is actually a bit later, so late 1950s, early 1960s, which brings in gas stoves with 4 burners and a couple of ovens, possibly only one oven, usually not a grill. And actually it was quite rare for people to use the ovens because they were so used to cooking on the top of something and sort of frying off things. So there are probably people who could answer that question much better than I could, but certainly what I can tell you from urban history is the gasification campaigns come in quite late. And in fact, my flat in Petersburg has not got gas at all, it's got electricity. And that was a kind of really interesting cultural difference, because I was sort of lamenting to a Russian friend how my flat didn't have gas. And he said, oh, because that's really prestigious, you don't have gas. And I said, but I don't have a choice. You know, I can't decide whether to use electricity or gas. And he said, who would want to use gas if you had electricity? So that's a kind of another stage. I mean, so, you know, this flat was built in I don't live in a wonderful old palace, it's a 1987 flat, and so it dates from that sort of period. I'm now quite glad that I don't have gas, because I think sort of if I leave a burner on, it's not quite as devastating as it would be with a gas burner. But that obviously wasn't the whole rationale. But the primers is a really big thing. One of the things I've talked a bit about in this book is how cooking is changed by the primers, and I've got a theory that the reason that people liked Napoleon, which is the sort of cake that's made in layers, is because you can make that in a frying pan. And you can do that on top of a primer, so you don't need an oven to make that. I mean, it may be better if you make it in an oven. People often still do sort of make it layer by layer in a roasting tin which they push into the oven, but that could be done on top of the primers. So, and then lots of frying, of course, would go with that. And fridges, and then kind of the rise of the fridge is another thing. And so in Voronezh we didn't have fridges. You could hire them, but we didn't. It was too complicated. So we kept everything between the double windows, or out on the balcony. And I had a tongue. I mean, I committed horrible crimes with this tongue. I was given a tongue actually by a Ukrainian friend, and it came in on a train from Kiev. And I kept it on the double window, and then it unfroze during the thaw, and then it refroze I don't know how many times. It was still fine in the end. And I cooked it, and it was absolutely delicious, one of the most delicious things I've ever had in my life. After sort of, several months on the window. And another terrible time we committed, we dropped a jar with twaroga in it, with this delicious curd cheese, and it broke. We still ate that twaroga, picking bits of glass out of it, because it had been an hour's return walk to the market. The market was quite expensive. We didn't have anything else to eat, so we just coped with that. And that was probably much worse than it would have been anybody local, but that was how we lived as students. There you go.
Well, a huge thank you to both of you for joining us here tonight. That was just so interesting. And thank you to everyone who's come in person and watched online. Our bar is open next door if you'd like to stay with us for a drink. And of course we have Catriona and Alyssa's books downstairs for sale. So, thank you again.